This is Judaism Unbound, episode 544, Tisha B'Av 2026, part 2. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Lex Rofberg.
And I'm Rena Yehuda Newman.
And today we're looking forward to a conversation with Andy Kahn and Dania Rajendra, two amazing Jewish thinkers on all sorts of topics. But today the topic will be the observance of the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, a Jewish holiday that's coming up in just a few days as this episode is released. And maybe you are listening to this episode on the 9th of Av because you went to your podcast player and searched Tisha B'Av or the 9th of Av and found your way here. So if that's you, welcome. Wishing you a meaningful observance, whatever it looks like. So before we dive fully in, a couple brief Judaism Unboundments. First, stay tuned in the near future for our courses in the Yeshiva, our 3-week mini courses, to be posted at judaismunbound.com/classes. It might be the case that they're already there as this episode is being released. It may also be that they're posted in just a couple days. In either case, head to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more about these learning opportunities for the month of Elul, the on-ramp month into the Jewish New Year, into Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. There are 3 amazing teachers, Chava de Cordova, Lainey Solomon, and Alicia Jo Rabins, who are teaching with us. Also, our Yeshiva graduation ceremony for students in our certificate program who are completing their course of study is on August 2nd. So don't miss that. Head to judaismunbound.com/certificate, click the button to register, and we hope to see you there. Now, a little bit more context. Last week, Rena Yehuda and I had a conversation about the 9th of Av, reflecting on our own relationships to the holiday over the years, ways that we struggle with it, ways that we find deep meaning in it. And we wanted to have a follow-up with 2 amazing folks, and so we're thrilled to feature Andy Kahn and Dania Rajendra to do just that. A little bit more about these 2 guests. Andy Kahn is a native of Tacoma, Washington, and majored in religious studies at Kenyon College in Ohio, where he also spent a year studying at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba and Hebrew University in Jerusalem. They continue their studies with an MA in Religion and Modernity at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and a Master's in Hebrew Bible from the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. He received rabbinic smicha, that's ordination, at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. After ordination, they served as associate rabbi at Congregation Emmanuel of the City of New York until 2023, then served as the associate director of Yachad and adult education at Congregation Beth Elohim in Brooklyn. They now serve as the executive director of the American Council for Judaism. He is the author of the edited volume, The Sacred Earth, Jewish Perspectives on Our Planet. Dania Rajendra is an organizer and a writer who has worked at the intersection of racial and economic justice for 25 years. She is now the interim managing director of the In Our Name Fund and works with Andy Kahn on Abolition Judaism and the American Council for Judaism affiliate program. She was a 2024 OSF Equality Fellow and the founding director of Athena for All, a multi-issue coalition of U.S. NGOs tackling the problems Amazon poses to our society, democracy, and economy. She's a past chair of the board of Political Research Associates and has served on the boards of JFREJ, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, the International Labor Communicators Association, and the advisory boards of American Council for Judaism and the Diaspora Alliance. Dania's written reflections have appeared in The Forward, Jewish Currents, Jews School, and the anthology What God is Honored Here. Her political analysis has appeared in Dilettante Army, In These Times, Truth Out, and many more. Andy Kahn, Dania Rajendra, welcome to Judaism Unbound. Andy, it's great to have you back, and Dania, it's great to have you here for the first time.
Really glad to be here.
Thank you so much.
Yes, so we are really excited about this conversation, which maybe is a strange thing to say about the 9th of Av. Woo, we get to talk about this day of deep grief. But I do actually think that there's reason to be energized about a conversation like this. And I wanted to start building off the conversation that Rena Yehuda and I had last week, where Rena Yehuda spoke beautifully about going to a summer camp where there was no 9th of Av experience, but they had a practice of fasting for the 9th of Av, and this sort of awkwardness there, being in a Reform context where the day didn't totally exist for the camp. I talked about my own experience growing up in contexts where it was observed, but my own struggles with it. And because I know that, especially Andy, you have spent a lot of time learning about Reformed Jewish history, I'm kind of curious if you could unlock those experiences that we had and others have. Why in some places is the 9th of Av super central and important? Why in other places can you be a deeply engaged synagogue going whatever Jew and still not know what the 9th of Av is? What's kind of happening there? What has led to that over the course of Reform and broader Jewish history?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it actually gets to the core theology that sprung from Reform Judaism in the late 18th, early 19th century that has mostly been erased. A lot in my experience when I was at Reform Rabbinical School, the early reformers were looked at as if they were like almost traitors to the Jewish people because they saw in Jewish emancipation in Europe and in modernity a sea change in the way that Jews could and should relate to the places they lived. This presages, I guess, the contemporary like diasporism thing, because they would not have used the language of diasporism at all, but they fully believed Jews should be fully integrated into the societies they lived in and be bringing Torah to make those societies better, more just. Really, that the goal was that Torah would be interconnective across the world and rebuilding a totally new, more just world by people locally doing that work. Tisha B'Av is a problem in that self-understanding because it is a mourning day for the moment in which the temple was destroyed two times. The temple in Jerusalem, where all ancient Israelite and Judean practice kind of revolved around a sacrificial cult that allowed them to connect with the divine. And that temple, by the time it got destroyed the first time, and certainly the second time, the first time was by Babylonians in 586 BC, the second time by Romans in 70 CE. By the time it got destroyed, there was this sense that it was the only place that sacrificial cult could happen, and therefore the only place that people could connect with God. There's this whole tradition of it being a huge day of mourning, Tisha B'Av, and that even over the course of history, every bad thing that has happened to Jews all over the world has kind of gotten lumped into the practice of Tisha B'Av as just a grief day, a day where we ritualize the performance of grief. But it relates back to this experience that actually happened twice of the temple being destroyed and then a desire for that temple to be rebuilt and this previous incarnation of what it meant to connect to the divine to be reestablished. The reformers very explicitly, when they first began this project of Reform Judaism, late 18th century, early 19th century in Europe, and then it moved over to America rather quickly, didn't want a rebuilding of the temple, didn't want a return to Palestine. They thought that our purpose was actually out in the world, and they reread the destruction of the temple not only as a tragedy. Of course, they saw that it was a horrible thing to have experienced as a human being because it was like a military incursion that was very destructive and killed and maimed and tortured people, but that was actually planned from the get-go. And that previous mode of practicing Judaism that involved animal sacrifice was necessary for that time period for those people to actually be inculcated with the ethical Torah that was now the foundation of what Reform Judaism would be after emancipation and in modernity. So in America, there was a conflict even within the Reform movement as to how to deal with Tisha B'Av. Should it just be ignored completely and like cast aside, or should it be recast? Rabbi David Einhorn, who was one of the early founders of Reform Judaism in America, in his prayer book, he had his own prayer book. That was the norm back then. There weren't really movements yet, so like rabbis kind of made their own prayer books. He had a prayer book called Olat Tamid, and in it there is this really fascinating reading for Tisha B'Av, which talks about the horror, the mourning, and that was a really long time ago. And that actually today, we don't seek a rebuilding of a physical temple or a physical Jerusalem that all Jews should return to, but that on Tisha B'Av, we do the mourning, and the mourning turns to a hope for renewal and even celebration of the imminent coming of a new Jerusalem and new temple that is global. It's not located in one place. It is the construction of a just and righteous society through the work of Jews working together with their neighbors in their nations to build a just world.
A really amazing thing about working with Andy is that I come from a complementary but wholly different Jewish American tradition, which is the radical left.
And wholly and different.
Wholly in both senses. I'll just start by saying that the tradition I grew up in, the left tradition, I'm a red diaper grandbaby, is as Jewish as any other American tradition, and as holy. So I think it's really important that these theological conversations were happening in a larger context where all societies, especially, but not exclusively in the European and American, US context, were having enormous conversations and revolutions about what it means to be a democracy. Like, this is the moment we have the push to universal mail and then eventually beyond mail franchise. This is the moment. It's like the middle of the labor wars in the United States. This is the moment where people are articulating all kinds of ideas about what it would mean to be free, including abolishing capitalism, and that was like a very normal part of political discourse. And I think it's really hard for us now to imagine that is a normal part of American discourse, but for decades it was. So when we think about the theological conversations that happen in the United States context in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it is very much inflected by all of these discussions about what it means to move forward the project of universal human emancipation, and in particular, what it means to move that forward in contrast with ideas of empire and conquest, which the United States was also pursuing at the time. And so I find it very interesting and beautiful that those political conversations show up like a palimpsest in these prayer books.
Both of you have pointed out in different realms or spheres of history how there was a moment of really serious flux. The Jewish future or the human future or the capitalist or anti-capitalist future, like none of these things were actually set in stone. And where we are right now, in which I think there's a sort of pervasive nihilism or like a sense of futility about like, it's always going to be the way that it is. And the way that it is bad and leading us to like some kind of apocalypse, because it's actually like easier to try to envision everything falling apart than it is to actually think about new solutions. Both of you are pointing out, both in the context of the early reformers, within the Reformed Jewish context, people are having these really radical ideas about what Jewish history can or should point towards. And Dania, I'm hearing you talking about, from a political standpoint, we're going to experiment and think about all of these different political and economic systems that might actually yield a better result. It really brings up something that I've wondered about a lot, which in the context of Tisha B'Av is what direction of Jewish philosophical forward-facing does our observance of Tisha B'Av actually orient us towards? Andy, I'm hearing you talking about the reformers saying, like, actually, we don't want a third temple because being in diaspora, even if they wouldn't have used that word, is great. We're actually glad that the temple was destroyed so that now we can be integrated into other human societies. So, okay, so that's like one option is we don't face towards the temple. But I'm also thinking about other political and or theological orientations that are like, we rebuild the third temple, but it's actually this totally conceptual thing. Or we think about Mashiach, the coming of the Messiah, in a way that isn't necessarily about Jesus coming back and isn't just about like one human being coming to save all of us, but about this vision of Olam Haba, about the world to come. And so I think my question then for both of you, coming from the different backgrounds and histories that you've been highlighting, what visions of Tisha B'Av feel the most relevant to you in your work that help us aim towards a more unbound or optimistic or frankly, like different or radical revolutionary future? How does Tisha B'Av fit into your worldview, and what is it oriented towards from a more future-facing standpoint, seeing that it is a holiday that's really about history?
You know, the Einhorn approach was what you were just suggesting, Rini Yehuda, just this idea that, like, yeah, we're leading towards what is symbolized in the classical idea of Moshiach and Olam Haba, but we're not taking that literally. We don't think some dude's going to come down and save us and literally rebuild a temple and return us to days of old. People aren't experiencing the horrible things that are recorded in the Book of Lamentations, which is the book in the Bible that's traditionally read on Tisha B'Av that is just full of horrible things happening to people. Like, our goal is to create a new world in which these things are no longer happening at all. One of the things that is really important to consider when we're talking about the classical reformers is that they knew about Zionism, they knew about the Jewish National Project, it was such a minor concept at the time that they weren't reacting to it because it didn't really have much power. And so they couldn't have foreseen how the Zionist project would take that same symbol system and like do the exact opposite, not turn it into this metaphorical kind of spiritual focus towards building a better world, but instead saying, actually, no, we're literally just going to do this. We're going to just like literally go back to Palestine and try to rebuild this stuff. And most of the time, the early ones weren't trying to rebuild a temple, but once you got Rav Kook in there in the early 20th century, there started being an idea that, oh, we should just rebuild the third temple physically and then the Messiah will come, or something to that effect, which is now a very major strand in religion and politics in Israel. What I'm trying to do, and I think I can speak for both of us a little bit, is to recapture that earlier mode of Reform Judaism that was aspirational and that was creative and that was trying to look beyond just the tangible, but also integrate into that all of the knowledge that has been produced over the past 130 years or so about what it means to actually do the work to make a better world. I do not mean to cast shade on these men, and they were all men, which is a product of their time as well, and it needs to be addressed, that were doing their best with Enlightenment thought and modernist thought. But as we all of us here know, and probably most of the people listening know as well, intrinsic to that modernist thought were reifications of human hierarchies of who is superior and who is inferior. And a big part of what the reform movement was trying to do was not necessarily flatten those hierarchies entirely, but in some ways turn them on their heads and say, okay, so the Christians have been telling us for millennia that their coming Messiah, the rebirth of Jesus, is going to be what fixes the world. So we're going to actually flip that on its head and say, no, the Torah tells us we actually have to work towards redeeming the world using the values of Torah, but the Torah, the particular text of the Jews, is the thing that will lead to that, right? Which does just kind of flip the hierarchy rather than investigating the need of a hierarchy altogether. And my hope with Tisha B'Av and using the kind of thought forms of the early reformers is that we can integrate all of this into understanding what it means to grieve what has happened in the ancient past and the recent past, but that grief can be eventually used to help us see a new way. And so I think that Tisha B'Av can be directed in that with that intention as well.
So a real advantage of coming as an adult to the religious, or what I might call legibly Jewish part of the tradition, is that I am unencumbered by this piece of it. Like, I've never been a Zionist. I've never had an argument with my parents or grandparents about Zionism. We all agreed that colonialism and imperialism is bad everywhere. And so that makes me pretty different, and it gives me a different position around those questions, I think, which I am discovering in my time on the quote unquote Jewish left is a real advantage. So I might start with something that Sarah Jaffe wrote in her book on grief and organizing about grief as a rupture, a concept she borrows a bit from Judith Butler, the idea that grief is anathema to capitalism. And I would say, when I lost my dad, like, the worst thing that could have happened to me in my nuclear family happened. And it made me feel like I could, sort of borrowing from James Baldwin, face anything that needed to be faced. Baldwin has this great line about not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is faced. And facing the fact that my dad was gone is a fact that I cannot change, but it gave me the courage to face a lot of things. And I think really sitting with the invitation implicit in Tisha B'Av to feel the grief that many people feel about the profound failures of American institutions, including American Jewish institutions, and not limited to American Jewish institutions. The failure of the myths of the United States that many of us grew up with allows us to face that in new ways. And I would add, what's more available to everyone politically this year is that when we face a future that we begin to construct together, where we imagine something better that grows out of our values, like B'Tselem Elohim, everyone is made in the image of the divine, that we can reimagine the place we are with our neighbors and then work towards it. And one of the things that Tisha B'Av offers us is the opportunity to gather and to use grief as a rupture to imagine something else, and that we can only imagine it together in community is something that Tisha B'Av offers us, and we should not squander that offering. And I think that's the lesson from the canvas to elect Zohran Mamdani. That's the lesson from the organizing in Minnesota. That's the lesson from the gains that the Green Party was able to make in the UK. That's the lesson, right, in the places. That's the lesson from the social democracy successes in Mexico and the success of Claudia Sheinbaum to, like, we have these lessons and we can draw on them, and we can remake what this holiday is for us if we start with the presumption, which I understand to be very traditionally Jewish, that not all of the information is in the Torah, that we are connecting what we know Jewishly with what we know in other ways. And so I would say, if you're not up on your anti-colonial revolutionary history or theory, Tisha B'Av is a great time to do some group text study about how you want to interplay your thought and your action, or what we call on the left praxis.
For what it's worth, I think that might hit people as like, ooh, an alt way of doing Tisha B'Av. But like, given that the texts that one might traditionally read on Tisha B'Av, like there's Lamentations, there's Eicha that I'm going to come back to in a second. But really, like, pretty much all of the texts in biblical canon that are like super depressing and sad are in play as traditional texts one might read. Some people read the book of Job. But I think folks who are trying to, you used the word legible before, to be part of the legible Jewish part of the tradition, quote unquote. I like that phrase. There's a tendency to go to the biblical text, to go to Talmudic texts, etc., and to think that wrestling with the contemporary or modern would not be that. And so I like that you're pushing in that direction. I want to get practical. I want to name, like, this episode is coming out a little bit before Tisha B'Av, and like, we know from past years, because we get emails and such, that like many people are listening to this while sitting on the floor on the 9th of Av itself. They typed in Tisha B'Av or the 9th of Av into their podcast app, and this episode came up, and they're engaging this kind of like they might engage that colonial theory text or the Book of Lamentations. And I'm wondering, what would you encourage them to be doing today? That you've given us one piece of that, Dania. And I'm curious how we might weave together some answers that are not on the bullet point Wikipedia page of the 9th of Av, that like, oh yes, one would sit on the floor to lower one's body and be uncomfortable and get into a physical posture of grief, along with other creative ideas. And so, given that one of those traditional practices is to engage with the Book of Lamentations, which Andy, you alluded to before, I kind of want to bring it into the space. Like, I had a lot of deep feelings about the 9th of Av in like every direction. I grew up feeling its intensity, feeling the gravity and the weight and the sadness and the grief, and even kind of liking that. It's a weird thing to say, liking that there was a day on the Jewish calendar to hold deep grief, to hold sorrow. And in retrospect, it's very strange how the Book of Lamentations, the Book of Eicha, was very much like a sideline piece of my observances. It was much more like, hey, the Holocaust happened. Hey, there was the Spanish Inquisition. Hey, these temples were destroyed. Hey, go through the list of tragedies. And it wasn't that we have this vivid, outrageously awful depiction of a society collapsing, of complete and utter destruction rampant, which the 5 chapters of Lamentations depict, and which I would argue it's depicted in the text and in the structure itself. Andy's smiling at me as we record this, because we had a whole conversation where I gave my hot take that this book, in my view, it is structurally a depiction of complete collapse, because it starts with a series of a bunch of acrostics A to Z, Aleph to Tav, poetic acrostics. And then the last chapter is not an alphabetical acrostic. It literally goes from structure to disorder. And it's talking about the journey from a society being very structured, very together, having the temple, having this worship, etc., to a situation where children are dying in the streets. And those in the elite realms of society are now impoverished and nothing is going well. I'm curious what it might look like for people today, whether they've grown up with like a deep Tisha B'Av practice, or maybe especially if they haven't. What would it actually look like to do this on, whether it's today for those listening on the 9th of Av or coming up for those listening before?
A part in Lamentations I return to is all her inhabitants sigh as they search for bread. They have bartered their treasures for food to keep themselves alive. See, O Eternal One, and behold how abject I have become. May it never befall you, all who pass along the road. And so there's this pivot, not to mess with your poetic structural analysis, which I really love, Lex, as a poet, but there's this pivot, right, from how abject I have become to may it never befall you in this. And when I return to the text of Lamentation and this particular turn, it reminds me that this gift of Tisha B'Av is to do the imaginative work of being in destruction and committing to a future. And that reflects, y'all are the rabbis, but that reflects my experience of Jewish mourning rituals, which is you sit low with your community in the loss, and then you have a temporally structured way to re-engage with the living world. And that when we say Kaddish, we are looking outwards to others. A very human experience of grief is to allow it to make us selfish, that it makes us inward focused. The pain can be incredibly intense, and it can push out other experiences. And in this and in Lamentations, I feel the continual reminder to choose life. It is necessary but not sufficient to be with our texts. We are required to make sense of the moment and to do the work necessary to be able to choose, to be able to rebuild. Like, we need the tools necessary to build in order to rebuild or repair. Whether you do that during this day, while you're fasting, or whether you find a way to incorporate those tools into the way you practice. I see in this part of the text that reminder of the holiness of the endeavor.
I think that the use value of Lamentations is really in that it does mirror grief, and at the end, as you said, Lex, it kind of like does the acrostics of attempting for the first 4 chapters, or however many chapters you think it is.
Sorry, just to explain that to listeners, there are six alphabets worth of acrostics fit in 4 chapters. I think it's important to the book that there are 6 of them, and then 1 disordered chapter that mirrors the 6 days of the week and Shabbat. Andy was arguing with me a little, but also co-signing that, just so folks aren't confused.
Yes, I was arguing with you because it's fun to argue with you, mostly co-signing. And I think that another way of looking at that is that those first 6 attempts at plugging grief into an acrostic form, right, trying to contain this overwhelming experience within something that is it is a human structure, right? An alphabet, and like trying to make everything fit just so, fails. And the final chapter is the acceptance of that failure, the acceptance that no matter how much you try to contain grief and put it within some kind of bubble that you can manage, you can't manage it. It will continue breaking out. And I can also share just from my own perspective of having lost my father fairly young, that you get to a point where it's no longer this overwhelming emotional experience all the time, but that grief is still a part of you. And chapter 5 of Lamentations stops trying to structure stuff. It's just like, this is what happened. It's really bad. God, it seems like you may have forgotten that this happened. This happened. Can you help us out now? Those first attempts are trying to structure it so that we can fix it. And then the last chapter is an acceptance that you can't fix it. It's broken. And it's up to us to both allow it to be as it is and then to start moving forward with it. In this moment, this particular Tisha B'Av moment, like today, 2026, a lot of people, including myself, are desperately trying to structure the mass chaos that is happening in our world and trying to understand it and grasp it and grapple with it and slit it into boxes of like, oh, this is like that happened in the past. This is like that happened in the past. And therefore, if we do X, Y, and Z, we can make something else happen. And like, we have to do that. That's what humans do. But the practice of Tisha B'Av both reminds us that we're not alone in having had our entire worlds overturned, right? This happened over and over and over again throughout history. And this very early text, very early human history shows that humans have always responded in this way. And we can take a day to stop trying to slot it all into these nice little buckets where we can control it and then manipulate it and say, okay, this is where we are. Let's sit on the floor. Let's feel it. Let's accept this moment. Then we can actually think about what world we want to build proactively rather than reactively.
This year, in 2026, Tisha B'Av invites us to sit with the wreckage that is our inability to stop the genocide. When we read Lamentations, of course, we think of the destruction of Gaza, or at least I hope. Well, I am thinking about the destruction of Gaza and what Lamentations will be written and the intense responsibility that we as citizens of the United States bear for that. And that it is true that the understandings of politics have been tested and have failed. And we don't know how to stop it. We don't know how to stop the right-wing international. And Tisha B'Av offers us a reset, and a reset to be with the profound grief that we've failed our neighbors, we failed our immigrant neighbors, we've failed our Palestinian neighbors, and we must remake ourselves. And that grief is confusing, and we can just allow the confusion to be. I really loved what you said, Lex, about how the last piece is Shabbat and the disorder of Shabbat and the freedom of disorder. There's a lot about institutional American Jewish life that mirrors the culture that characterizes American life that is oriented towards order and control. My experience of grief is one that invites me to renegotiate that. And I hope that people who might be fasting, sitting on the floor, reading Lamentations, can be invited into some letting go of what we thought we knew in order to make room for what we must make together.
I'm really thinking back, Dania, to something you had said earlier in this conversation, which is about grief as rupture. I think usually when I think about where rupture comes from, it's loss as rupture. But actually, no, it is grief. It is the emotional experience that allows the rupture or the breaking to take place. There's this phrase that I think about a lot, which is prefigurative politics, and the idea that there are worlds that we can imagine before we make them, and it is in fact the act of imagining that makes those things possible. They don't just come into being ex nihilo. It's not just out of nowhere. When I think about the text of Lamentations and I think about Eicha, it's so visceral. It's so alive. Interestingly, like if we're doing this sort of textual analysis, I really like thinking about chiasmus, right? So the idea that things are bookended. So you have a structure that's like A, B, B, A. And Eicha is 5 chapters long. And there's chapter 3, which is smack in the middle.
Shouts to ABBA, by the way, on the ABBA front.
True. We have this third most central chapter, and it's where it turns into first person all of a sudden. It's like suddenly out of this kind of like third person narration of just like every terrible thing that's happened in the destruction of Jerusalem, you have this first person narrator who emerges and is basically talking about their experience. It's very intimate, it's very visceral, and it's very alive. I think part of the invocation of having this be part of the structure of Lamentations is that the book is asking us to personalize that grief. It's not actually supposed to just be this conceptual exercise. Too often I think as everyone here has kind of touched on, the orderliness of something about the Western professional system is that everything has to be very structured. We fit all of our grief into one day. We think about huge numbers of people. We do enormous death tallies, so we don't actually have to sit with the individual loss of life and the ways that those numbers are completely beyond human comprehension. Part of this idea of grief as rupture is that rupture is what allows things to stay dynamic. And if we've also inherited in the Western tradition this idea that history is static and it's this sort of like gradual upward curve, that it becomes unconceivable to us that the things that are happening in the Book of Lamentations are continuing to happen today. And so this question then of grief being another room in which we can experience transformation and rupture, it's absolutely necessary for prefigurative politics, because we have to look at Lamentations and say, there are actually similar, if not the same kinds of suffering that are happening in the world today. We have not graduated to a quote unquote more civilized world. Now we need to sit with the ways in which history is a dynamic spiral. And from that place of grief and disorderliness, come up with things that are better or different tactics or different visions about what comes next. And so I think the question that I then pose to both of you, because I actually think we have to kind of ground it in the practical or in the tangible or just like real things that we experience. What are the ways that grief can help us defeat the evil in the world? I mean, and like what personal or political experiences or theological experiences have you had of the rupture of grief giving you a new idea?
So something that Andy and I have been working on very deliberately is to borrow from these other traditions, like workers had institutions they needed to build in order to make worker organizing represent them in the United States from the late 90s onward. And we did, and it changed the institutional landscape. I'm really excited about how ACJ is a home for people who are thinking about what it is to make Jewish communities where we experience and experiment with decommodifying and democratizing Judaism, where we spend time really understanding, like, why does the form of Judaism, religious Judaism that most of you have inherited, take the form it does? Like the constellation of institutions that make up American Jewish life are authoritarian. The mainstream institutions of American Jewish life are predicated on exclusion and expulsion, and that reflects the politics around them, that many institutions are organized around exclusion and expulsion. And because they're organized around exclusion and expulsion, they have remade many people's idea of Judaism in that image. And so I find great meaning in our work and great inspiration in the work of the people we are lucky enough to be in community with, thinking about why is that and what kind of experiences of Judaism can we co-create so that Judaism can be something else. Because if we don't co-create something else, we might as well just turn the lights off.
I want to lift up the idea that Dania and I have been kind of writing on, which is abolition Judaism. Initially, we didn't mean it to be in response to reform Judaism, because, abolition and reform are often seen as two different reactions to issues. And
in the context of like prison abolition versus prison reform.
Precisely, yes. And one of the things about this moment and the feeling of failure that so many people are having around the genocide, around the ongoing incursion of ICE into our communities, various forms of social collapse that are happening, is if you kind of peel back the layers, because I think so many of our responses have been of reform rather than abolition. Abolition isn't just about stopping a thing from happening, within the entire constellation of society and reacting to that one thing and keeping it from happening anymore. It is about actually looking at the fundamental nature of the society you're living in, why it has led to these outcomes, and revisiting those foundational issues with an eye to rebuilding that society with those issues almost turned inside out. And the idea that Judaism, this is going to get a little spicy. The idea that Judaism is an ethno-religion is fully predicated on this idea that you have to be part of a particular ethnos to participate in Judaism as a religion.
And just so that people can see more from the two of you on this, we're going to show note your Shavuot article that talks about Ruth not being necessarily part of the ethnos that story is about. I think this ties very well to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the overturning of that necessity for an in-group, out-group dynamic of Jewish practice, of Jewish belief, of Jewish even identity is integral to this rebuilding process in America and beyond of what Judaism can and should look like. That key fundamental issue has been a seed in Judaism since the conflict of the book of Ruth and the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, where Ezra and Nehemiah is another book in the Bible, and a big chunk of it is about necessitating a purity of blood for these people who are returning from Babylonia to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, right on topic of Tisha B'Av, that was their response. We need to not only reconstitute this temple, but we need to reconstitute a sort of I don't want to get anachronistic, but I'm just going to say a sort of blood quantum version of what it means to be Jewish in that time. And the book of Ruth does the opposite. You can read our piece to see what that is. But today, we need to continue wrestling with that dialectical issue underlying so much of Jewish history to understand what Judaism can provide towards a abolitionist view of what it means to reconstitute our entire society. It's not just about Jews. It's not just about Jewish institutions. The problems in Jewish institutions are the same problems we're having in other American institutions. And so the beauty and incredible power of Torah is that it allows us to look back at how these issues have been wrestled with in the past and how we can bring that abolition lens to seeing Torah as a counter-hegemonic force in this moment where the hegemony is one of violence towards anyone on the outside.
So I, of course, want to take the remark about how there are problems in Jewish institutions, but they also are part of many other kinds of institutions. And I want to ask about Jewish institutions as a close, which maybe that's annoying. I don't know, but it can totally be that you connect it to something broader. But I thought about a starting question that I didn't ask that feels like potentially a good close, because I really want to be explicit around that. There's the famous joke. Oh, there's a Jew on a desert island, and they find the Jew there, and she's like, "Thanks for saving me." And she gives a tour of the little island, and she says, "Well, here's the synagogue I built that I go to, and here's the synagogue I built that I don't set foot in." And I want to ask the two of you, given that I think implicitly under the surface we are critiquing ways that a lot of Jewish institutions operate generally, but also specifically how they navigate the Ninth of Av. For me, for example, the ways that the Ninth of Av I most commonly see channeled really are not solidaristic. They are really not about Jews in conversation as part of broader movements and broader world. They are often really explicitly about our uniqueness, our tragedy, and the takeaways, the moral actions that we are supposed to draw from that are not always about partnership with people beyond Jewish life. Rini Yehuda and I spoke last week about maybe the 10th of Av should be specifically about us in community with those who aren't Jewish. Maybe if we're gonna think about Jewish specific damage, trauma, destruction, that we need to think about something broader. But my question to the two of you, if not that, what is the Tisha B'Av you won't set foot in?
there's a line very close to the end of Lamentations that I think people often don't know where it came from or don't know where it is because not that many people read Lamentations, and it gets used constantly every week during the Torah service. Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva chadesha menu kakedem. Take us back, Eternal One, to yourself, and let us come back, renew our days as of old. And this line is used in the Torah service when the Torah is being put back in the ark. And it's a little mournful in the service, but it's certainly not as mournful as it is in Lamentation, where this is, it is followed in Lamentation by the speaker saying, "For truly you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us," right? Like that part gets left out in the Torah service on Shabbat mornings. I think that second part is what most often gets focused on in traditional Tisha B'Av observances as this idea that Jews are a uniquely oppressed people in the world. Our experiences of trauma are what define us. We are unified as an individual people, which I just have to say, as always, I don't think we are an individual people. I think we are many peoples. But we are unified as an individual people because of the shared traumas we have. And that Tisha B'Av is a time we get to really go to town on that and focus fully on all the different traumas that we have experienced as a way of defining ourselves in total, right? That those traumas are the defining factors. But that leaves out the Chadeshim Menu Kakedem, the renew our days of old. That forgets that over and over and over again throughout history, Jews have continually looked backwards, not just to be like, oh man, bad stuff happened back there, but oh man, really interesting creative stuff happened back there. And let's look back at how those people, whether they're our physical ancestors, our spiritual ancestors, just people that we're looking to for inspiration, responded after the fact and built something anew. That is the kind of frame I try to put forward in response to this idea that we just need a litany of horrors to focus on Tisha B'Av, because that's what actually defines us. I've noted since 2023, many communities have also started including October 7th as part of the litany of things that have happened passively to Jews throughout history that are horrific. That's not to say that it wasn't a horrific trauma upon those who experienced it. All of these things are. But if we allow that to be a defining factor, even in just Tisha B'Av, allow that to be an anchor point for Jewish identity, then we aren't doing the work of renewing our days of old, or the imagery of putting Torah away and then saying renew our days of old is saying, okay, we've read the Torah, we've gotten messages, we've gotten divine guidance, and now we have to go and do that work.
The artificial insularity produced by legacy Jewish institutions is pernicious. So I guess any Tisha B'Av where our family members and neighbors who are not Jewish are not welcome and celebrated as part of the renewal is a Tisha B'Av I wouldn't set foot in. And I want to end by reminding us as Jews in the United States that most Jewish people in the United States are unaffiliated with any religious institution. And so any Tisha B'Av that isn't about organizing the unorganized and meeting people where they are and making spiritual sustenance for reimagining the places we live alongside our neighbors is deployed for anti-democratic purposes. And M. Gessen recently won the Pulitzer, and they wrote in a column that I'll give you so you can include in the show notes, the idea of moving toward an imaginary center to reclaim something, we know that doesn't work. The only thing that can possibly work is a visionary, loud, appealing alternative. That is our mitzvah. That is our obligation. And any Tisha B'Av that suggests we know enough to co-create that with our neighbors, I would argue, is equally pernicious. Our tradition teaches us to experience the grief fully and not to surrender to it. We're not a death cult. We are obligated to choose life, and that is often the more difficult choice.
Thank you so much, Andy and Dania, for joining us. It's been such a fantastic conversation this time. Thank you.
This is so fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. It's a heavy topic, but I hope that we did justice to a new way to think about it.
You absolutely did justice to this conversation, both of you. And Dania, I love that you said this is fun. May all of our conversations, even about Jewish grief, have slivers of joy in them. And to all of you out there who are observing Tisha B'Av, it's not that I'm going to wish you a joyous day, but I do wish you a deeply meaningful day, whatever it looks like. So thanks to all of you out there for listening, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As we close things out, a quick reminder, be on the lookout because soon at judaismunbound.com/classes, there will be amazing opportunities for learning in the Anya Shiva. You can sign up for our 3-week mini courses that will be present there. It might be the case that as this episode is being posted, they're already posted there, the classes. But if not, they'll be there in just a few days. So judaismunbound.com/classes is where you'll sign up. Financial aid is available for anyone who needs it. Another brief note, our graduation ceremony for the Anya Shiva certificate program is on August 2nd. It's coming up very soon. We hope to see you there as we celebrate 8 amazing graduates of this program. They are pioneers in all sorts of cool forms of Jewish learning and unlearning. You'll get to learn a little bit from them and celebrate their achievement. So that's on August 2nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 a.m. Pacific. We hope that you will join us. You can register by heading to judaismunbound.com/certificate and clicking the link there. So we'll now close things out by encouraging you to be in touch with us, as we always do. First, you can send us a message via Facebook or Instagram. Our handles are @JudaismUnbound. Second, you can always head to our website, judaismunbound.com. Check out show notes for this episode, all sorts of other juicy materials from our past episodes, and all of our work generally. You can email us at hosts@judaismunbound.com. That will go to both Rini Yehuda and me. And we are super appreciative if you're interested in supporting us financially, which you can do at judaismunbound.com/donate on either a monthly recurring basis or just via a one-time gift. So thank you so much for listening. Wishing you a meaningful Tisha B'Av, whatever it looks like. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.